Hello, everyone. Since we have enough number of participants, without delay, we'll start the session. Once again, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Linda, working as Senior Software Engineer Geospatial at CDPG. A warm welcome to today's Data Dialogue session. The topic of today's talk is Designing the Digital Address DPI in the Era of DPDP Act. India's digital public infrastructure has emerged as global benchmark from Aadhaar enabling identity to UPI revolutionizing payment. These platforms have shaped how interoperability, openness, as well as the scalable digital systems are perceived. However, with the enactment of Digital Personal Data Protection Act, DPDP Act, as we say, in 2023, there's a fundamental shift in how data is governed, placing major emphasis on consent, privacy, purpose limitation, and accountability. Today's session will explore this transition through the lens of DHRUVA Digital Address DPI, which is currently being developed under Department of Post, Ministry of Communications. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Ms. Aparajita Mridha, Assistant Director General, Ministry of Communication. So Ms. Mridha is a career civil servant with Government of India and is currently serving as Under Secretary in Ministry of Communications. She is an MPA, Master of Public Administration 2024 graduate from Harvard Kennedy School, where she was awarded both prestigious Raymond and Josephine Vernon Award and Lucius Littauer Award. Her professional journey includes experience in legislative drafting and parliamentary procedure in India. She has presented Government of India in multi-ministerial negotiation and is a former fellow of the Indo-Pacific Young Leaders Program. She is presently leading efforts toward building India's digital address, digital public infrastructure, a foundational initiative aimed at redefining addressing system in our country. Her areas of interest lie at the intersection of geopolitics, emerging technologies in South Asia, making her uniquely positioned to speak on evolving relationship between digital infrastructure, governance, and public policy. With great anticipation, I now invite Ms. Mridha to deliver her talk. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Linda, and warm welcome and gratefulness towards everyone who has joined today's session, and also from the team at IISc for having me. So today's topic, this is as you can see on the slides on the screen, it says Digital Address DPI, but it will be a combination of legal as well as technological learning, I think for all of us. So I mean, just before I begin, I wanted to outline a bit of what we'd be discussing over this session specifically. And I think Linda has already given a great introduction. So I'm just going to jump off straight from there. Of course, it's a session that I hope is going to be useful and interactive for all of you. So I do look forward to a lot of engaging questions from the listeners today. So, um, navigating, why exactly am I navigating or discussing policy design for a DPI that is not already in existence, right? There are so many digital public infrastructures already in place in India. We see you have Aadhaar, NPCI, some of the examples we gave earlier. Um, but why is it so important to have a discussion of something that is currently in development? Um, in today's time. So, this is also a really important topic in light of various conversations happening at the ongoing AI Impact Summit in New Delhi, which is about navigating policy design in the light of the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, the DPDP Act, its subsequent rules in 2025, and developing new systems and ecosystems under what this act actually envisages. So, the reason I'm discussing something that's already in process or something that's currently in process is so that the both of us, that is me as well as the listeners, can really experience um, this process or this learning experience sort of like it is in real time. And then we can sort of hash out a few details, such as frameworks, protocols, acceptance mechanisms, so on, and basically governance experiences that are very different in today's time and in the time before. So the agenda today, the basic outline that I'm going to do is first, I'm not going to be highlighting the whole of the DPDP legislation. That will take a lot of time, but I do hope to touch upon some of the really broad, important points that I will be touching on that I think the discussion would be helped by. Second is the design of the digital address ecosystem itself. I understand there is not a lot of familiarity with what this new ecosystem will have. So this presentation is mostly to direct that discussion on what exactly this ecosystem will have. Then I will get into how the two are interconnected. That is using this as the digital address DPI as sort of the framework for the future discussions. And then, of course, a small but I think essential sort of reflection on the future of technological development forward. And then we could just jump into questions right after. So, to begin with, I'm just going to give so this is like, let me just straight off jumped into the slide. This is actually the issue that we were being faced with while designing the Dhruva digital address system. The problem statement, as you can see, is that addressing itself, because the Department of Post deals with a lot of addresses over a period of 150 years, that there are addressing practices not known to a lot of people, but it's very heavily text-based, human memory based, and vague structure based. For example, you might have seen many addresses people write opposite the big red board or next to the very big lake, or it's not very direct, very not very clear, not standardized. So this also this many of these lead to misdelivery. I mean, I would say like service delivery errors. You also have unstructured formats. You also know they're unstructured in the senses what exactly you have to put in an address depends varies greatly from region to region across multiple linguistic, cultural diversity, and there is a lot of inconsistency in that. There is also fragmentation, and what I mean by that is that addressing databases, that is what maybe we think of as your PIN codes, are not in line with administrative boundaries, and those are also not in line with some of the other jurisdictional boundaries, databases that might exist. For example, what might be used by police for their jurisdiction, PIN codes, of course, for the postal deliveries, and then you have other kinds of delivery databases, all of which are not always in line with each other. So whatever comes at the intersection of multiple boundaries ends up becoming a very gray area requiring human interpretation and variance. So with this kind of a problem, and also there's not much data on this slide, but there was a lot of detailed studies done in 2018 by MIT that actually estimated that the loss to the country from delays due to poor addressing systems and addressing inefficiencies is about 0.5% of our GDP. So I think that is what triggered the approach towards using a technological and a standardized approach. I mean, a combination of technology and standards. And of course, on the right, you can see what were the basic outlines or the basic principles behind this particular ecosystem. But before we get into the next few slides, I'm just going to touch upon the DPDP Act. So when the DPDP Act came in 2023, of course, its subordinate legislation jumped in around in 2025. But let's just stick to the Act for a moment. And in 2023, one of the most important, I would say, features of the Act was to specifically not just call information or data as like this is just data about a person, but to clearly draw that distinction between personal data and its application to personal data itself. It limited its scope to it, and whether collected in a digital form, not digital, and also like not digital form, but then subsequently digitized. I think this personal versus non-personal distinction was extremely helpful for an ecosystem where, such as the digital address, where address itself has a lot of misinterpretation. As I said, it's unstructured. So there's a lot of misinterpretation that address means you have to link the name of a person to everything that's in an address. But that's not necessary. It's only when the features of an address can clearly, unambiguously link a human being to that address would it become personal information or personal data. But on its own, an address can have attributes, individual parts. Like if I just share a pin code, which is a part of an address, that doesn't actually link a person to it because a pin code is a huge boundary. And so there are parts of an address that can actually not be considered personal data, but of course, address with the name of a person and with enough features can actually indicate a personal data and a personal connect. So that's the first. The second point I want you to reflect on or remember is the concept of affirmative consent. Consent is the underlying basis for processing personal data. So having free, specific, informed, unconditional, and unambiguous consent is very, very important for this act. For them to bring user consent in a very, very detailed, clear, so that there is no doubt about what user consent can be and to give it the broadest ambit possible was the second feature that I think deserves some attention. And this also needs to be confirmed by clear affirmative action. That is, there should be no, again, to add to the unambiguity of the consent, it needs to be very, very clear, along with the possibility to revoke, withdraw the consent at any time with the same ease that was there from giving the consent. So it should also be very easy to give the consent. It should not be the most highly complex problem, which again makes it puts it back in the gray area of what exactly consent is. Um, the data fiduciaries under the Act are required to also, again, in order to enable this information, provide knowledge, provide information, provide knowledge in simple, clear language, where that whenever personal data, such as address, as I just mentioned here, if it's the address along with the name, that it is collected based on consent, what purpose it is being collected for, the purpose of processing. This is another very important thing that which is actually a clause about notice, and this will become important as I go through the presentation today. So I'm just highlighting the important parts of the DPDP that I think will be relevant for today's discussion. Um, the next one being the obligations of a data fiduciary, because these are the parties who will be collecting this information. And so they have to be in compliance with the DPDP Act. And they again have to obviously provide this information, give clear notice that what the information is being stored for, where the personal data is going. And where these data fiduciaries are like when they're processing personal data, um, and there's a possibility that during processing it would be like shared with another data fiduciary. This also requires some amount of they do have some obligation in that sense to ensure accuracy and completeness of the personal data, non-additions, non-modifications at their end, and also similar compliance liabilities, because essentially it's giving a sense of responsibility and obligation to these entities that are dealing with personal data. um, I think there are a lot of like other clauses that also do go into detail about especially entities that handle massive amounts of personal data, certain obligations for them, the question of whether or not you have consent managers or not. But I think these 4 points, I think, should be enough for us to kickstart the next process, which is the discussion of the DHRUVA, which is actually this digital address DPI. This DPI is known as DHRUVA, DHRUVA. This stands for Digital Hub for Reference and Unique Virtual Address. So we'll just be getting into the DHRUVA concept itself and what exactly DHRUVA is going to do. Here's a basic system of, this is just the outline of DHRUVA itself. It's being envisaged as a core public infrastructure that's the reason core is important is because address is foundational. It is across ecosystems. It goes across private sector, public sector. Pretty much everyone, every person, multiple systems use address. So it has one of those foundational nature within it that allows it to go beyond just a very, very specific, narrow area of use because the address itself is used everywhere for public and private service delivery. Um, Another goal of Dhruva is the seamless integration, as again leading from this between the private and public sector. It is a multi-sectoral ecosystem that is being involved. And of course, point number four is one of the most important parts of this, which actually leads into this discussion, which is the secure and consent-based sharing of address information is being worked into the Dhruva ecosystem from the start. This is very important because compared to other foundational DPIs in existence, which were there before DPDP, consent-based management has been worked into the system post DPDP as, let's say, they didn't know DPDP was going to exist. So it was more of, I wouldn't say an afterthought, but it was a future mandate. There was this ecosystem built, and then you had to plug various entries into it. But this is one of the foundational DPIs in this era, because of which consent and security of consent, as well as user centric approach, is being built into it or designed into it as we start itself. This is just an outline of the thematic working group. So I'm just going to skip that and go straight into the global experience. Behind this, a quick touch on the global experience is actually on the key takeaways. The Dhruva ecosystem or an address management ecosystem is not being seen for the first time in the history of the world, but it has already existed in various forms in other countries. I would draw, if anyone is actually interested, I would draw attention to the Estonia address data system and Australia's GNAF. Both of these are actually as close as possible to this particular ecosystem, although they are being developed in a framework that, because their digital protection laws are not designed in the form that the DPDP is, placing user consent right up front. So that is something that I think is new in this particular law. And second is that this is not, they're very sector specific. The reason many of these databases are used is to enable public service delivery for very, very narrow fields. Whereas the digital address DPI being envisaged for India is actually very broad sector. So this is going to be more of multi-sectoral approach, private and public, whereas in other countries there is some amount of limitation, very heavily government managed, and also that sort of limits the sectors that it works in and that it can contribute to. So this is what the two layers are of the digital address. The first one, the base layer, is the DigiPin. This is a 10-digit alphanumeric code, which basically, it's very simple. It has already been released open source in India, which basically uses latitude and longitude coordinates in order to provide a 10-digit alphanumeric code, which is essentially designed for a precision, location precision, and easy integration of GIS within multiple ecosystems. And at the same time, the DigiPin also, I think I have a slide on this. Yes. So the DigiPin is actually, it has a fixed schema. So this DigiPin layer, a bounding box is built around the territory of India. It has a fixed set of symbols, which is alphabets and numbers, which were chosen for a specific reason. And these same numbers are in the exact format that you see on the screen, put into bounding box, which is divided into a 4 by 4 grid. Each of these becomes one region. It gives you the first character of your DigiPin, and it goes through 10 iterations, like one box within another box within another box 10 times in the same format to give you the smallest unit, which is actually a 4 meter by 4 meter point, which is very, very small. Um, so it's much more accurate than existing location identifiers in the country. I think one of the most common being PIN code. This is the most accurate navigational pointer, that location identifier in a machine readable and human readable form, that has emerged and becomes the base layer for your digital address. So here is what your digital address layer is going to look like. So the digital address is going to be very similar to what you see in the UPI. Um, that I'm sure most of us have used the UPI payment system. So it's going to be a user-defined consent-based label. So you can design the label that you're going to have. It'll be user-controlled. And this ecosystem, so this within this label, you're going to have one digipin and the other descriptive address layers. But when you actually share your address, to which we're going to get into right now, when you share this, you only have to share the label, and the rest of your address information is maintained with the user itself. And the user can also change factors. For example, when you move house, when you move cities, when you move locations, you can always change it. You can also, there are many other forms worked into the consent framework, such as you can revoke consent. You may not need to share your address and all your address information with, let's say, a delivery agent for more than a day or two. Because you may not live there, you just wanted, let's say, you wanted something delivered to your place for a certain purpose, and you don't want to have this your entire address information there. For that purpose, you can share the label and then set the consent to like a much shorter period of time, like maybe a day or two, and then on its own it gets uh that particular user will not be able to see your consent. So there are a lot of features built into this ecosystem around this user defined label, but we won't get into the details of that. Just wanted to stress on the federated architecture that this ecosystem is envisaging. This is going to be what you see here, the key players. Governance entity, which is going to monitor this ecosystem, and within it, we have labeled these entities as address information providers, who are those who will be maintaining the suffix. That is, those who are maintaining the digital addresses, the providing the storage capacity, the sharing capacity behind it for the AI will be the AIPs, which are your information providers. You then have information users. I mean, here are just a couple of, I know this seems like a very vague thing, public and private service providers, but this is essentially those who want to use the address. So someone will send a request that I need this address for these purposes, and then the user will get a notification and then they have to consent to it. And for this purpose of consent management, this ecosystem envisages consent managers. And here is an important part of DPDP. These are your AIAs, address information agents. They will be managing they will be the ones interacting with the customer actually, because that's where the consent comes through. There's a lot of technical architecture in the background. The ISC, of course, is more than well aware of it. But this is essentially, these three players are the most important within the ecosystem. We do have another one called the AVA, because we're building an additional feature on top of this ecosystem to have certain entities that are authorized to verify addresses. But I think that would be a bit too detailed for the purpose of the focus of the DPDP Act. So, what exactly? So, now that we've gotten in through a few provisions of the DPDP Act, you've understood, I hope, a little bit of what we're building within the DHRUVA ecosystem, which is essentially an address management ecosystem, and allowing the address management within the customized label to be with a user or to be with a person, rather than sharing massive amounts of like address information, which may or may not actually be accurate. So we're building a standardization concept as well as the technology, something that I touched upon in the first slide. Um, so I hope you can actually get to see that you can actually get to see a little bit of this in the very short slide that I presented. So what can we, in the interest of time, I do think there was a little bit about the core principles. I could, which were mentioned in the beginning very shortly, but I will touch upon them now that we're getting into how the DPDP Act ties into this digital address, and the main principle. This is what shaped this address, the principles behind this ecosystem to begin with. So one of these is, of course, user centricity. You can see it here in this particular slide where it says consent-based data sharing. The second is privacy by design. So this itself is, as I mentioned earlier on, privacy is being built into it from the moment the ecosystem is being designed. This is a a new requirement. This is something that will be like one of those trial tester methods that that work into future DPIs, because it's so foundational, address is so foundational, and it's one of the most broad scale DPIs coming up. So having privacy built into it from the beginning is also proving to be a case study for smaller DPIs that are also being planned within the government of India. And I think that's actually something quite interesting and worth a little bit of discussion on if we do get the time. It's also being envisaged for private-public collaboration. You can see it at the bottom here that says cross-platform integration. And this is important because scalability and interoperability, openness, open source database. The DigiPen has been released open source, and a part of this ecosystem is to actually help create uh, interaction between multiple databases, both of government and private sector, which relate to address information to strengthen a larger, more standardized open source address attribute information distribution panel. Which is we're giving it a name, address attribute registry. It's something that's going to be built over time as more and more entities both within the ecosystem or within the country end up using standardized, recognizable, machine readable address formats. And that's something that could develop, which could then help these are the four that I would like to stress upon. It's interoperability, privacy, and user centricity, as well as scalability from the very beginning. So what can we actually look forward to? I want the session to be super, super productive for all of you. So I think we'll just very quickly jump into the last, I would say, like the final portion, which is what are all of these aspects absolutely necessary for each and every DPI coming up in India? So when I'm saying what can we look forward to, we're thinking of new digital public infrastructures coming up in the DPDP era. And while they are compliant, does it mean that all these DPIs will have to have a similar structure? Not all of them, and not all features in the same degree. This is very essential to remember. Like it doesn't, this is not a one style work all kind of model, and not at the same level as this particular DPI. And there are a few aspects here that I would like to stress on as to why I'm saying this. One of these is that the DPDP Act does mandate user consent, user information, centricity, providing a notice about where the information is being used. However, this law does not actually necessitate having consent managers. This is the flexibility that the law, the DPDP Act provided, and I think that is it is just the broad scale of the ecosystem, the sheer number and volume of beneficiaries and stakeholders within it, and the sheer number of participants that we are envisaging that has sort of led to uh, throughout here. These are just some of the use cases, but just look at the broad scale of beneficiaries that we're envisaging within the Dhruva ecosystem. There are just so many. These are just some of them, but the scale of the ecosystem, because it is being built at population scale, having a federated architecture, as well as making a design choice to introduce consent managers, thinking of the volume of consents that might exist in the ecosystem. It's important because when you're designing a DPI, what kind of architecture is apt for it? What kind of solutions you want to look at? Like, what is the DPI trying to solve? And who are the participants and beneficiaries in it are one of the most core governance questions that you get into before jumping into the DPI and taking from the DPDP Act provisions that support this form of governance. You don't want to use the act as something that binds you, but rather enables you. So um, there are certain ecosystems that because they have a more narrow scope, they may not need to take separate consent manager companies. You do have, like, for example, like DigiYatra is one of the very a much narrower scope of I would say like operations, because it was mainly used just for like airport, like to simplify your processes in airports. And it's a fairly decent, I think, a fairly recent example to look at why you wouldn't need a consent manager, someone who's just set up to manage multiple consents, and you would rather look at the possibility of taking consent for in a different method without this entire framework. Do we always need a separate governance entity for this ecosystem? Not always. So when you look at who is setting up the DPI, right, when you're building a governance model, the DPDP Act again does not is not too strict about. It has basic principles that it's relatively strict on, but it doesn't actually dictate the entire method. And so this was also a design choice, that regulatory, like the amount of strictness you want to have or not have within your ecosystem depends on who you want there. So Dhruva is very broad, and hence, and again, an evolving ecosystem, which is why this ecosystem envisaged a separate entity as a governance entity. But you do have the health stack, that is ABDM, and the agri stack, which are managed, which are again rapid databases for narrow purposes, which are specific purposes, which are managed by different government ministries. So the flexibility that you afford to the manager, or I would say the governance of the ecosystem, again depends a lot on like what are the use cases you see in it, and where do you expect it to go, and also how much you want to scale. However, what is dependent, what do we see in all our discussions, and this is going to be the last bit of like food for thought I'm going to give before we open up for questions, is like where do we see a lot of these future DPIs, what you might end up seeing in a lot more frameworks other than what you're seeing in the digital address. Um, might be data minimization aspects, because you cannot share all parts of data that can sort of link to a person. So you don't want all your information to become personal data, therefore, sort of limited by the requirements and obligations under the law. So you might see account aggregator frameworks becoming more frequent, which is taking out certain parts of the information and allowing it and sharing various, I would say, like more like anonymized information, or just parts of the, or separating larger blocks of information into like smaller blocks, very similar to the address being split up into smaller machine readable parts, such as the DigiPin, rather than the massive address as a whole block. So that's something like data minimization options are something that we're seeing. And also, I think the digital address does. I mean, I don't think the digital address has it at this point itself, because it's still in process. It's still something we're building and we're discussing, and we're looking forward to seeing how it grows. But the concept of significant data fiduciaries. So this is basically classification of different kinds of data fiduciaries depending on the quantity of data that they are handling. And of course, a bigger one, which I think the governance entity, once it comes into existence for digital address, will also have to follow. But basically, they have higher scrutiny and assessment requirements, which is something that we will probably, which that particular governance entity will probably be getting into as and when it's designed. Right now, it's not really there. But these are, I think, like interesting things that will develop from this particular law coming in, and that we get to see in the future. I think like lessons that we might draw from the act and see in upcoming DPIs as we go along in this DPDP era, post DPDP era. So I think with that, this is going to be enough food for thought for today, at least from my end, because I did, I hope, get to like adequately explain a little bit about what this address ecosystem is, and what it took from the DPDP Act, and maybe how future DPIs might look. But these are, of course, all of this is a work in progress, and it's something exciting to see in the next few years, how this ecosystem develops and goes. So with that, I am going to be done with this presentation. And I don't know if Linda's on here, but I think we could. open the floor for questions if you think that's okay.
Yeah, sure. We'll go with that. So thank you again. We now welcome questions from the audience. You can unmute your mic or you can post the questions in the comment. I think we already have a question in the chat. So, do you
Yeah.
want me
Oh,
to
yeah,
read
I've
it out?
just opened it. Oh, I
Yeah,
could read this
please.
out. So how would you monetize the address information system? So this information system is actually not just for what you see, because I think that's what the DigiPin is for. What you mentioned here, I think I could just read out. I did a survey for a privacy app and found customers unwilling to pay. They're comfortable sharing GPS location. Um, but yeah, and business companies already store it. So yes, this is not actually like an address storage format. Even if you see most company apps today, you are still entering your address in there. You have, like, most people would enter, like, let's say, unit number, a floor number, some a few more, like, even though you have navigational systems. I'm going to give Swiggy as an example. You can put search your area. You type in an area with your fingers. You say, I'm living in whatever, Lajpat Nagar, New Delhi, and then you get, and then it auto populates some amount of it, and then it continues from there. Therefore, this entire ecosystem is planning to remove the aspect of entering multiple features of areas. So the only information that these providers, which are those who want the addresses, will get, that in Swiggy for the next time, you just have to enter your address label. In the back end, Swiggy will get the part of the address information that they need, that has that they won't actually have to, whatever their existing APIs already include. Here you just need to enter your label, and if you change your house or so on, you just need to change it once on the application and not repeatedly enter the address again and again. So I think this is something that it's already like in testing stage, and I think it's basically changing the way you represent your address, not only address management, but the way you represent it. And there was a lot of like research done. I think eventually we will be publishing some of the research as well, because it's just information at this point. But I think there are a couple of articles and discussions on it. But more than happy to share these with all of you once the discussion is over, or to, of course, share it with the ISC team so they could forward it on feedback that was received from multiple participants previously. Wait, I think I've like skipped a lot of them, but yeah. So here is, okay, so what will happen once I map myself to the data? Can I unlink at will? Okay, so yes, you can unlink it with. So at this point, you are just going to have. So DigiPin is not unique to you. So when you mean map yourself, you will not be tied to a single DigiPin or location. You are just linked to the address label, that particular label, which you will get a drop box showing you the various labels, the like similar to how you see in NPCI, your bank shows up, and that's how you get your ID. But here you don't have a bank, you'll just have certain options which are already available. Some will be free, some will, like, those who are some will choose like more affordable models. And I think the only options which might is if you want to have a suffix that is provided by your institution, or you want a very, very unique one, or if someone wants to buy it for some premium purpose for a certain club of people, that they'll all have that club or that organization's name, then there might be a cost to it, but mostly that might just be borne by the organization. Um, so yes, the short answer, yes, you can unlink it. Will the entire system is user consent based, so you can just close it and unlink yourself. Um, Below that, let me see. I will share the slides at the end of the presentation, so I will definitely send this across to the team here, to the host team, so that they can forward it to you. Yes, I could do that. I also see Rohan's question. So hi Rohan. How will consent system that work across multiple platforms? Um, I'm not sure what. consent systems across multiple platforms evolve. Okay, so mostly, yes, to answer your question, I think this is like, again, it's like a learning process. Everything under the DPDP is itself a learning process. But consent has been, it comes back to the clause that I mentioned a little earlier, where there is one who's taking your consent, right? The data fiduciary, the first point where you give your consent to certain information, and then that information being used for, let's say, going into another channel. Let's say that you might have, like, you give consent for X, and then it goes into, like, it has a processing end at after that and goes to another platform. Right now, you may not have to give consent repeatedly, but the point at which you give your consent, which is, let's say, the person who's first taking your consent and clearly states the objectives it's taken for, they have to mandatorily comply with that when it goes to the second um, entity. They have, it's sort of like, I don't know, like how you'd have, I'm just trying to think of a good example, but sort of like the leasing format, where you even if you sublet and sublet and sublet, it's still the person who's made the initial contract who's responsible. So that's probably most, the DPDP is designed to have consent systems that work that way. But I think now that they're coming up with a new set of subordinate legislation post 2025, I think you can see one of the subordinate legislations is on consent managers and consent management specifically. So I hope that would be a little helpful. And obviously, I'm sure if you'd like, I could just share that link along with the rest of the material. So, right, so I'm going backwards because I think I've jumped all the way to the bottom. 4 meter by 4 meter, yes, we do have it's satellite image. We are partnered with Map My India and Esri India that provide the high quality satellite maps as the base map for DigiPin. Slide shared, yes. At what stage is the solution? Actually, the prototype development is completed. So right now, the only part which is integratable is DigiPin. That has been made open source on GitHub repository of the Department of Post. So the DigiPin right now has already been incorporated by multiple government agencies as well as private operators. So you can already start using the DigiPin. And there is also a website or a web application called Know Your DigiPin, KNOW space YOUR space DIGIPIN, that is Know Your DigiPin, to sort of like help you get familiarized with it and access all of this information. So this is open source, but the digital address is currently, because as I mentioned, it's a scheme which is in progress. The only part that has been developed is the tech architecture, which is still in testing and prototype stage. But it hasn't yet been released. It requires a certain governmental process, which is currently in negotiation at the government level. But yes, the technical architecture is being tested out at this point. Um, okay, so at this point, thank you so much for the devil's advocate question. Um, Right. So here there's some amount of there's some amount of access to what you may or may not be adding as your address. Mostly the main address check that's there at this point is the digipin. So when you're entering the address at a certain location, and the digipin, as I mentioned, the 4 meter by 4 meter precision marker, so that might trigger when you're entering the address for the first time. So I think that's going to be one. So it will give you, like, I think similarly you do see a lot of how do I say, like delivery applications right now, which show that you've arrived at the location for around like a 200, like 100 meter sort of area around it. So that might be the accuracy checker on it. And even with one of the things is, because of the digipin aspect linked to it, that's the main thing that gets added along with the rest of your information of address. So the second aspect that I would like to like add on this is, eventually within that address label, the address standardization format itself is being changed. This standard is going to be changed by the BIS, which is the Bureau of Indian Standards, which only requires your digipin as the 2D, your ground mapping location identifier along with just unit number and floor number. So even if there's you just enter the word Antilla, but like you the geo-referenced pin code boundaries or any of the other boundary databases don't match with that digipin, it'll just get rejected at the top. So that's something that's being built in. Didn't have a lot of time to get into this bit in this presentation, but that's basically what it is. And I think maybe when we send the documentation across, I hope, send the slides across, I hope it'll make a little bit more sense to you. So right now, there is no live demo data, unfortunately, but we really hope that once those approvals, except for the DigiPin, which is again available on that website, we live data, the live demo would probably only come up, I would say ideally once the governance entity gets set up. And I'm thinking we're looking for like around a year's um, timeline, like a very broad one, but yes, it's probably a year ahead. But we obviously, because as I said, the tech architecture has largely been built, so maybe that might be considered for feedback or released in a more closed environment for input. So I think that's it. Yeah. Satellite data. So basically, no, you can't. So the vertical aspect, so the 4 by 4 meter grid is 2D. So like it has not been narrowed down. The DigiPen has not been narrowed down to include vertical data above because that is the unit and floor. The vertical data will be typed in, whereas the ground data, the path that databases already exist for, is what the DigiPen will be covering. So, right now, the quality of the address is not yet in existence. So I'm just answering Vidya's question and then I'll go upwards. So right now, there's no mechanism to capture the quality. But once it's expected that there's a mechanism built in for confidence score development. So the more and more confidence score along with feedback mechanisms will be built in. So as more and more persons use that location, you'll have a way of sort of like self-validating that that is a location or that is an address or not. On top of it, there are these agencies that I didn't go into detail on in the slides because, of course, time, but they are called address validation agencies or AVAs. And these agencies are going to be authorized agencies who will be registered with the governance entity to under the DHRUVA framework to actually carry out the physical verification process if requested. So if only with consent, if someone says, then you might end up getting a tick, like a verified tick, when you know the quality of that address. Addresses with a verified mark or a tick, sort of like what you see on X or on Instagram or any of the other, sort of like a verified validation in addition to the existing address is something that's also being envisaged. Um, yeah, so when you're using a particular, it's entirely your choice. Like the verification process is going to be asked for by you. So you can say that this is an address I want verified, and the list of verified agencies will come. And then you can click the agency that you want for verification. Most of these are government, so they will be the more like authenticated verification. However, for the sake of delivery or to increase confidence score, private sector personnel will also be options. So for the purpose of delivering at an address, like you want food delivery, for example, you can always choose like let's say Swiggy or Zomato if they decide to sign up. And you can, for food delivery purpose, if they have already successfully made a delivery, then probably the address exists. Risks envisaged once this gets implemented. So one of the risks that, okay, so there is some amount of market capture risk that's seen because I think that ended up happening when when you have like, I think like we've spoken to a lot of like those who build foundational models, like one of them being NPCI, where one of the main risks was seen that like there are already those who are, I would say, information providers who are right now going to be onboarded on the system, but some of them already have GIS-based address databases with a lot of information already available with them. So there's always the risk that they just have to, ensure that massive labels are released and they manage multiple labels and those those who already have addresses with them, they can just force them to convert. So I think there's like a market capture risk that does exist. And then we are definitely aware of that. And we have built a model around it to price down and to have more equitable market at the point it starts. And also because it's a federated architecture, we are not I think the DPDP Act does help a lot in this, because like this information storage is not actually, the entire bulk of information is not being stored with any of the participants. It's all going to be various parts of the label that are going to be stored, and there's a central mapper that's going to be under the governance entity alone, that's going to have a view on all these participants within and what they can store and what they cannot, and consent logs and so on. So that sort of like keeps it away from agencies who might be like, we already have all of this, so the moment we jump on board, then we can just like capture this whole amount of data. But I think the DPDP Act has actually put in an advantage in this sense to sort of like tackle the market capture aspect to it. So, well, so I think I've really gotten through a lot of the questions. I don't know if I've actually missed anything. But thank you so much. These were really exciting and really great to answer. Okay, so I just asked Linda if there's
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah, I have one last question. So you mentioned the use case of addresses for informal settlements. So just could you just throw clarity on like whether the objective is providing residents in these settlements with a digital address, or like just spatially identifying and mapping these settlements for some planning purposes?
Okay, great. In this sense, actually, um, there was a slide which I didn't stress on again, so I will share this entire bunch with you. For this address, these digital addresses are not verifications of ownership. They are not for property purposes. They don't act as proof of address, or it's not to verify to link the person to an address, but rather a verification that that building or that address or that location exists. So none of the information that we're actually collecting as part of this, or I mean, that actually have to be fed to make this ecosystem work, includes any name or phone number of a person. So it's just entirely a combination of plus minus modification of at various parts of an address attributes, and more preferably over a period of time, just a GIS based attribute, which is the digipin. So that is the only one that, because it's machine readable and it doesn't really signify anything, it's just a set of alphabets and numbers. Um, just by looking at it, the chances of you like undeciphering it um, for property purposes will not be necessary, because there are already databases that do that. There is the Alpin, the ULPIN. You also have like Naksha. There are various municipal bodies also that have some kind of digital system and some amount of maps, proprietary mapping solutions that they have onboarded to be able to provide um, these kind of, to provide state governments with a map to, provide those services in that area. Because this is so broad scale, the what I meant from the slide, that informal settlements, is that there are informal settlements mostly involve highly clustered settlements that you see in urban areas, or in, let's say, even in rural areas. They can either be highly clustered or highly spread out, because of which the accuracy of providing services to beneficiaries there has been very difficult for the government. So this is actually a governance problem that's there, that the government struggles to, like, when you see only one location on a map, but once you go there, there's like five houses within it. So I think that because there's no actual proper building footprint data set in India, this is something that over time this ecosystem expects to develop as that goes in. So it's just basically multiple databases that might be spread out and used for different purposes, many of them not having informal settlements as part of their plan, because it's such a, we don't need the vertical data, we just need the 2D, the 4 by 4 meter grid as the base, and then the units to, in order to provide the service. So just to creating a precision point itself at the base then sort of integrates into the APIs of existing databases and ecosystems for whatever service they are delivering. So municipal corporations and so on can just link this to their service and just become more accurate about what they're already doing. So that was more for the DigiPin.
Okay, I get it. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, wait, that's
There's one
just
more
a really
question.
last. Yeah, yeah. So basically here so here it wouldn't this you don't actually have to subscribe to the API. It's just a simple algorithm, like a very simple source code. It's already available open source. So it's on the GitHub repository for the Department of Post. It's just a very simple source code that takes that locations, latitude, longitude, whatever device you're capturing it in, that location's latitude and longitude, and makes it into a machine readable code. It's not DigiPin is not designed to be used on its own. Like if I just say use a digipin by myself, like there's nothing really I can do other than know about it. But if you use digipin in along with other service delivery platforms that have accuracy as part of it or navigation as part of it, you can probably um, link with that. But yes, a sample digipin could just be like 39JLP. I mean, I could just search for it. I'll just put the name of the web application. It's just called Know Your DigiPen. So I think I hope it's, I don't know whether. So yeah, this is the web application. This entire web application was just designed for you to see how digipins look and what it generates, and you can keep changing the pointer and get more familiarized with what it looks like. But actually, the basic code is just like a very very simple source code that can just be that it's like a really simple code, a very short code that converts lat long into this code, and also if you enter this code, it converts it into the lat long. So it's just a location identifier on its own, unless it's merged with something else. It's more like for familiarization, and it'll only make sense once the entire digital address ecosystem comes in. Yeah, so I hope I answered that question, but I will be sharing before Linda jumps in here, I will be sharing some of the links of everything that's available open source, which is basically the geo-reference pin code boundaries as well as the Know Your DigiPin application and the GitHub repository link. Um, so in case you're developing, you see a use case for it and something that could be helpful for you, then I think this would be very useful. Yes. I hope that helps. Go ahead, Linda.
Yeah, thank you. So, how are you intending to share those, like in chat right now, or
I will be emailing it to I think like Namrata because I don't really have it on like available with me. Like I'll have to close a bunch of windows, but I do want to share
that's
it. So I will be sending it to Namrata, and you can obviously send it to everyone who's like signed in, if it's possible. Or how would you like to? Or if you could give me a minute, then I could like search for it. If everyone's willing to hold on for that time.
Ma'am, you could definitely send it to me,
Yeah,
and I'll share my email ID. Whoever is looking for those links can drop me a mail. I will share uh, those links with them.
that's great. Thank you so much.
so Namrata, like once you drop mail, hi.
Done, Linda. So I've shared my
Okay.
email ID. Please drop me a line if you need the presentation deck or any of the links being shared by Aparajita. Yes, Linda, please.
Yeah. So I'll conclude the session. Meanwhile, people can copy the email ID from the chat. Yeah, thank you very much for generously sharing your insights and patiently addressing each and every questions. Like your perspective on policy design, evolving governance framework, like for Dhruva digital address, has given us like a richer understanding of what building a foundational digital system in today's regulatory environment. truly entails. We deeply appreciate the time, thought, and the experience you brought to this conversation. Thank you so much, ma'am. And our sincere thanks to the participants for joining today's session and for your thoughtful questions and a very active engagement during the discussion. With that, we come to the close of today's session. Like, we have a very wonderful evening, everyone. We look forward to your continued participation in upcoming data dialogues. Thank you. So, before closing,
Thank you so
Namrata,
much.
should we give it 2 or 3 minutes so that people copy your mail?
Yes, please. Sure.
We have
Thank you so
officially ended
much,
the session.
team.
Yeah, yeah. Please, ma'am, go ahead.
Just want and I will be exiting right now. Thank you so much.